Hi, I'm Ray, and this is Willy. Willy, what are we going to be talking about in today's episode?
We're going to be talking about a little bit of the history of El Salvador, a little bit of the history of Utah, and then end on a very, kind of queer erotic note with some of the reading I've been doing lately.
Awesome. Welcome to the Poetry Vlog. My name is Ray, and today I am here with Willy. Willy, would you please introduce yourself?
Hey, my name's Willy Palomo. I'm currently in Chicago, but raised in Utah with family heritage from El Salvador. Nice to be here. Any pronouns work for me.
Awesome. And then would you please read a poem for us today?
This one's called Where Papi's Angel Speaks to Me from an Immigrant Detention Center. I use my shoes as pillows, as if to say my dreams are far from here, as if to say I am ready to leave at any moment. Use my shoes as pillows and whisper evening prayers into the soul so they can follow me the next day. Use my shoes as pillows and let the heels dig into my face. So when I return, everyone will see the countries I have crossed. Use my shoes as pillows and untie its mouth. Hold its tongue to my ear like a lover's and listen to her mumble a third shift inside. Use my shoes as pillows and peek through the holes to create my own night sky. Use my shoes as pillows and wiggle my toes off the edge of the bed like a tree. And remember how once I let my chancla fall like fruit, how now I must be ready to bruise fist and face for this thorn-torn pair of shoes, ready to run through another noon, through the soles and the skin on my feet.
Incredible. Absolutely incredible. May I ask, why did you chose to read this poem for us today?
A couple of reasons. One, it's one of my favorites. I was one of the first poems I wrote when I moved to Indiana to start my MFA. So I'm like kind of in this studio apartment in the middle of like a very rural state and conservative state where I didn't know anybody else and was starting to kind of just grapple with the weight of like what it meant to tell my parents' stories in the political context that we were in with like rising anti-immigrant rhetoric. And it's something that has, of course, only gotten worse since that time. But it's one of the first stories my dad shared with me when I first started actually being nosy enough and frankly rude enough to like poke him and being like, hey, you haven't told me these stories of what it was like for you and what you actually experienced. So part of what he told me when he was in the immigrant detention center, he found his fellow Salvadoran that let him know that he should sleep on his shoes, otherwise the detained Mexicans that were there would probably steal them from him. So it was like taking that idea and finding a way to make it something of poetry and of art, right? Of trying to get people like, hey, how can I get you to listen to the story? And also what these shoes kind of mean beyond just like this act and this story that my father told me. We're heading towards a political context where stories like these are going to need to be centered more. And we're going to need more folks listening to them. And I wanted to kind of bring that into the room as just like, yeah, it is part of where especially this first book project is focused, of how to give more of immigrants' own stories to their own narratives that are constantly being politicized and used against them, and poetry being just one small way to try to wedge into the conversation there.
Gotcha. That makes a lot of sense. I get that. I would ask, so I think there's also a similar climate there, Utah-wise. Obviously, Utah is very, very conservative as well. Have you found that, like, being a poet in Utah in this scene, has it been, like, similar to in Indiana? Have you experienced similar?
I think it's been like a pretty drastically different experience for me, but that's partly because I was raised in Utah. So I have a whole bunch of baggage in history with Utah that like I just don't have with any other state in the union. Part of what that means for me when I'm in Utah is that everything becomes so much more personal. I was raised Mormon and had that background and that set of like having come out of that and how that impacted me in terms of like my own identity development when it came to race, when it came to queerness. One of the memories that I talk about just because it kind of gets the point across quickly is that I am the darkest skinned member of my family. And of course, the Book of Mormon has the story of the Lamanites and the Nephites with the dark skin curse, the mark, all of that. And one thought that was in my mind when I was 9 years old was like, oh, I must be one of the most sinful members of my family because I am dark. And yes, the fact that like the religion created a culture and ideology where that thought would be in a 9-year-old's head is something, deeply troubling and concerning. So when I am in Utah, there's kind of that backdrop, so like there's ways where like being in Indiana allowed me to write these stories without feeling like claustrophobic with like the people looking over my shoulder. And what that meant for me is that I started writing to an audience that wasn't explicitly a white audience, wasn't like just the people who were around me, and it allowed me to escape that and just ask myself the question and focus in on who am I actually writing for. One of the poems in my collection, for example, where we finally see Mama's back, ends with a line where I ask readers to imagine themselves in my mother's position. And when I'm doing that for like an all-white audience in Indiana versus like a Guatemalan community in Chiquimula, like that question serves a fundamentally different purpose, and it creates just a different energy in the room with like either the love or confrontation that you're trying to make happen. So it definitely shifts pretty dramatically depending where I'm at. And I feel like that's one of the joyful things about literature is just seeing all the different ways people interact and engage with it.
Yeah, I like how you're talking about basically forced empathy, almost like forcing people, no matter where they come from, who's reading their works, to imagine themselves in the positions of the people you're talking about. That's so important right now, I think. So, Willy, a few days ago we were talking about socialism and leftism. How have you found yourself politically influenced as you've traveled from Utah and Indiana and even now Chicago?
Yeah, I think that's obviously a huge question because I grew up in Utah where, in fourth grade, I literally had a teacher who put it upon herself to explain to fourth graders how trickle-down economics works. And I feel like that sort of upbringing in the school system really devalued history. And it wasn't until much later that I became aware of just how much indoctrination and how much violence that erasure actually did of my understanding of history, period. I served as a director of the Utah Humanities Book Festival, where I got to travel all around the state. And what these experiences did was showed me a dramatically different history of Utah. I was really close in collaboration with the Paiute Indian Tribe of Utah. We had students from all sorts of places, a really strong Pacific Islander community, and people who had deep ties to Utah as a place that just were never talked about. And my own personal study had me uncovering and looking for things too. Some of these things are obvious and big enough where it's oh, somebody should have mentioned that. Like Wallace Sturman, who was a queer member of the Harlem Renaissance, a Black writer who was born in Salt Lake and frankly lived in Utah for a solid chunk of his life. He left to do work, but he did return to Utah in his adult life by choice. There's quite a few figures like this in all over of the United States, but particularly in Utah, folks like Joe Hill, who was executed for work that was more, labor rights and things like that, which are just histories that nobody bothered to tell us, or rather specifically erased and make sure that we didn't have access to, so that we would not understand the history of the landscape. It only really takes one generation to completely erase the cultural memory of what a space looked like before. So a lot of what I see as myself moving more towards the left starts with understanding these histories. Like, I left high school being somewhat wary of like leftist sort of thought and reading and things like that. With the history of El Salvador in particular, there is this anti-communism that comes from like, yes, the intensity of like the way that the leftists were crushed in El Salvador. So between 10,000 to 50,000, depending on which scholars you're trusting, indigenous folks were murdered, with the primary kind of argument behind that being, yes, that they're all communists. And my own family experienced that trauma during the armed conflict of the 70s and 80s in El Salvador, which was, backed by both the U.S. and Israel, funding and arming the dictatorship in El Salvador that was doing massacres against guerrillas who were inspired by socialist thought. The military could just kidnap you, especially your boys after the age of 12. They would just kidnap them and make them soldiers. And then the left was also recruiting, and occasionally, not to the extent that the military forces were, but occasionally they would like kidnap people and just force them to be like child soldiers and things like that. So part of what my mother's side of the family experiences in El Salvador is fleeing kind of both sides and then being accused of being communist. So I kind of entered this history with a bit of an anti-communist bias. And so part of what my own study of history has become has also been like, yes, teeing up these parts of history that were hidden from me, and then just realizing like, oh, what were the ideology of these writers that I loved and supported? And it turns out they were all more left than I was led to believe. Writers of the Harlem Renaissance. There's like plenty of folks out there. So a lot of what my own study and writing has become as I've kind of grown and moved has been like being more explicit about that and trying to understand what that actually means and what that means for today, right? But I think being more honest, yes, about like, yes, the sheer anti-communism that exists in this country, which doesn't allow us to earnestly engage with like economic arguments that Marx is making and like all the histories and how it has contributed to like well-being of folks throughout the world. And I guess the last thing I would say is the part that like, yes, made me like most sure that like this is just where my study needed to go was looking at Frantz Fanon, Wretched of the Earth. I read a Stokely Carmichael, a Huey P. Newton, reader, both last year, that both ended up like just being like, oh, this is what it looks like when you're talking about our contemporary context. And this just makes everything from like the genocide happening right now in Palestine to just like the politics of what was happening in El Salvador at the time to like what's happening in the US just makes so much more sense. And I guess like a thing I can add to that, just to take it back to like literature and its role, like as we're entering like this, next presidency, part of what we're trying to do is just preserve what it meant to be alive during this time and doing that honestly and realistically, and then having conversations about that, just because that's just a important historical document. There's the work of trying to preserve the literature that has already been written. I'm thinking about like histories in El Salvador, where the National Library has been throughout the past couple of years just dumping all of their archives and telling folks to get rid of them. They're old dusty books that nobody wants to read anymore. When a lot of the literature that is there, it was also the revolutionary literature of the previous eras that were being, kept well and there. And like that's part of what is happening in El Salvador right now, where it's not just like the current generation of writers that are being like disappeared and erased, but also like previous generations of history they're trying to remove. So like part of what I think of the work of like scholars and the work of like writers to do is like not just to document their own time, but preserve like the path of where we've been as well. Then there's also just the work that we have as writers when we create spaces with each other, right? Like we get to open up all these other questions and pockets to try to push conversations forward in like a number of different arenas. And like what that's meant for my book is sometimes like when I was in Guatemala and El Salvador for it, when I've been able to do events that are like just catered towards Central American communities, I get to do my little piece where I read a couple of poems. And what those poems primarily serve for is just triggers for folks for their own memories, their own questions, their own things in their own family histories that they need to process. And like when, elders in a room are given a space to finally share a story that they've just been carrying with them for decades and never able to share with anybody else. Part of the work that I did when I was in Indiana during the Trump era was start an undocumented student group and part of how that happens is we held a few undocu poets readings where we brought Marcelo Hernandez Castillo and Natalie Santos-Zapico into the community. And just with the presence of their stories and the conversations that started happening, folks in Indiana were like, oh, we kind of have a need for this. And the folks who organized the reading were like, well, it would be really stupid if we organize all of this and then did nothing about it, right? Like that's just like a not good faith interaction with these authors or the literature. Frequently when I read a book, I think about like, oh, what is this trying to teach me? And if there is a change I need to make in my life, like what does that mean? When I'm reading environmental lit, it's frequently meant like, yo, I got to spend more time in nature and develop a real relationship with this stuff because like, what is the point if I'm not doing that otherwise, right? Like why fight to preserve something if you're not actually there, like developing a relationship with it? And I think that that's something, especially when we talk about the role of literature, that's important to keep in mind is just all the different ways it can play out. In El Salvador, a lot of the poets who, during the civil war, during the armed conflict, part of the guerrilla were just poets who were one, arguing for the need for it, and two, literally decided to take up arms and like do that work of trying to confront the U.S. empire. So there's obviously like a spectrum of what that looks like. And I feel like what reading a lot of Central American literature and Black literature and a lot of different of these literatures, frankly, has done is just ask you like, okay, now what are you going to concretely do to try to push in whatever small ways you can?
Absolutely. So good. All right, so Willy, we also talked about before bringing pop culture artifacts or something that you really, really wanted to talk about. What did you bring for that today?
I brought in something really queer and weird, but it's a book I picked up in Guatemala. It's one where I just like saw it and I was like, okay, that's a hell of a title. So it's Pornografía para Piromaniacos, which is pornography for pyromaniacs. The thing that has struck me about the relationship between all the stuff we've been talking about, I'm thinking about like Audre Lorde's essay on the erotic, which talks about eros at large, right? It's not just the sexual she's talking about, but like pleasure and what it means to choose to live a life where these delights and pleasures are something that like you prioritize. And like if anything worth doing is worth doing well, then like if you're going to live a life, then the choice is to live it well and with as much like pleasure and joy that you can. And using that as like an actual barometer of like what you are willing to take and not, right? Earlier this year, I was like literally awake in the middle of the night and I ended up reading Anais Nin's Delta of Venus. And part of what struck me about it is that, yeah, there's the ostensible like erotica part of it, but there's also just the fact that all this sort of like queer, strange stuff that's happening before the contemporary language for like queerness was even developed. I'm also thinking of the novel Erotic Stories for Punjabi Widows, which is like this other fun, playful like take on like that. In that one, there's like a English teacher that's teaching this like refugee immigrant community, and then she accidentally leaves an erotica book there, and the like women just start writing erotica, and it just becomes part of the pedagogy. While there's like a backdrop of like other community issues happening, including like gendered violence, right? Where what I've been struck by all of these books, and especially Pornografía para Piromaniacos, is them using the sexuality as like, okay, this is like a topic matter, but it is also how we are going to unpack some of the like strange generational things that are happening. So one thing that I love about this book is that it talks about San Francisco's porn industry, essentially from like the 1980s till now, and talking about like gentrification, all the changes that happened, 40s like Latino male porn stars, and like the labor sort of stuff they're dealing with, and like also yes, they're trying to navigate what the new queer language is and why and how their stories are impacted. While there's like scenes that are yes, like yeah, it is just a gay porn scene that's being narrated, they also do such incredible work in like the description of it. And I don't mean like the purple prose, but like there's scenes, for example, where they become pivotal like characterization things. One of the darkest ones that happens, and I'll mention this one because this is just a Utah context, where they talk about like an ex-Mormon porn director that was doing like porn spin-offs of the temple marriage ceremony. So talk about blasphemy, right? Like talk about like, holy crap, this is dark. Part of what happens in that scene is that one of the actors starts overdosing. And then the person who's topping, who's one of the protagonists, ends up like being in a situation where he's like, okay, what the hell do I do? And the director is just like, keep going. And then he ends up like rejecting that and leaving infuriated, yes, as being like, that's screwed up that I was put in this position. The actor that was overdosing kind of survives, and the director ends up petting him like, I know my boys, you know, in this like very creepy way. But like that is the sort of like crazy stuff that some of these books are pulling off, and like unpacking like some of the trauma and histories of, you know, the overdose there is relevant also too to like the queer scenes in San Francisco, with the way that different drugs were like rampant in those communities, as like young men were trying to find ways to cope with all the trauma that they had, all the abandonment and alienation that they were feeling. And sometimes having to survive in the streets and things like that. Where I feel like there's a way about talking about this book that's kind of like, icky, there's like porn in it, where it's like, no, like we're unpacking like some of the like difficulty and challenges of this profession, and how these like characters are human, and like have interacted with the history of like all the stuff that we, you know, talk about, gender identity, sexuality, and queerness, and how it's evolved. So I've been like really weirdly like just carrying this book around and reading it and talking to anybody who's willing to hear about it, and ultimately feeling really enriched. And also like so much of our world is so alienated, where like people's pleasure and joy is not centered or focused in at all. So like reading this sort of literature has kind of brought me to a place of like, oh, what does it mean to be free in these ways? And sometimes that looks like these characters doing whatever they are doing, but like there's, of course, that's a deeply personal thing that looks different for all of us and doesn't need to be also like that kinky or strange. Thanks for letting me get on my weird soapbox.
So I guess really the moral of the story today is just not being afraid to talk about things. With communism, with this is erotica, with everything. Thank you so much for watching. Willy, where can people find out more about you?
You can go to www.palomopoemas.com, and I regularly update that with little publications, blog posts, but you can find links to like music, books, everything there. And then if you're on Instagram, Boombo's Finest.
Awesome. If you'd like to see more from The Poetry Vlog, you can check out thepoetryvlog.com/thepoetryvlog, where you can find playlists with this video and others like it. That's all for today. Goodbye.